It was supposed to be a place for rehabilitation, a second chance for troubled teenagers. But according to official inspection reports, some of the highest levels of violence in the UK youth prison system have been recorded inside one facility, HMP Feltham. Boys as young as 15, living in an environment where fear, gang tensions, and survival shape every day. How did a youth institution turn into one of the most dangerous places in Britain's justice system? And what really happens behind those locked doors that the public rarely sees? Tonight, we're going inside HMP Feltham, where every decision can mean the difference between safety and chaos. Make sure you watch till the end, because what you're about to hear isn't just shocking, it's real. And before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Behind Bars for more true crime documentaries you won't find anywhere else. It was supposed to be a place of reform. That's what the name suggests, young offender institution. Not prison. Not penitentiary. A place for rehabilitation. But according to official inspection reports, some of the most violent days inside Britain's youth custody system have unfolded behind the walls of HMP Feltham. In 2019, inspectors described parts of the institution as unsafe. In multiple years, independent watchdogs raised concerns about serious assaults, gang intimidation, and high levels of self-harm among teenagers and young adults. And here's the contradiction that still shocks many people. Feltham houses boys as young as 15. Yet the levels of violence recorded there have, at times, rivaled adult prisons. So how did a youth facility in West London become one of the most scrutinized detention centres in the United Kingdom? To understand that, you have to start outside the gates. HMP Feltham sits near Heathrow Airport, in West London. Planes pass overhead constantly, their engines roaring across the sky, a reminder that the world is moving forward, even if the lives inside are frozen. The complex is divided into two parts, Feltham A, which holds boys aged 15 to 18, and Feltham B, which houses young adult men up to their early 20s. On paper, it is designed for structured education, vocational training, and behavioral reform. In reality, according to multiple inspection reports published by HM Inspectorate of Prisons, safety has been a recurring concern. One inspection described an unpredictable and sometimes volatile environment. Another noted that too many young people reported feeling unsafe. Assault rates, including inmate-on-inmate violence and assaults on staff, were repeatedly flagged as high compared to similar institutions. The numbers tell one story. The atmosphere tells another. Let's talk about the violence. In 2017, Feltham made national headlines after the murder of a young inmate named Olaseni Lewis, although it's important to clarify, Lewis died in 2010 following a restraint incident involving staff. A jury later concluded that the force used was excessive and unreasonable. His death sparked widespread criticism of restraint practices within youth custody in England and Wales. His case became a turning point in public scrutiny. Years later, in 2019 and 2020, further reports documented persistent issues with use of force, segregation, and self-harm. According to official statistics from the UK Ministry of Justice, youth custody facilities across England and Wales saw concerning rates of violence during that period. Feltham was frequently cited among institutions struggling to maintain control. And this wasn't happening in isolation. London's gang culture was evolving. Many of the boys entering Feltham came from neighbourhoods where postcode rivalries and organised street groups had already shaped their identities. When they arrived inside, those rivalries didn't disappear. They intensified. Imagine being 16 years old. You've grown up navigating turf boundaries, certain bus routes are off-limits, certain parks are dangerous, certain faces mean trouble. Now you're transported into a locked facility, where members of rival groups are housed in the same building. There's nowhere to run. According to interviews cited in inspection reports, some young inmates described living in constant fear of being targeted. Others admitted joining alliances inside for protection. Protection quickly turns into politics. Politics turns into power struggles. And power struggles turn violent. Staffing shortages made things worse. Inspection findings repeatedly noted that too few experienced officers were on duty at certain times. High turnover meant newer staff were often managing complex gang dynamics without deep institutional knowledge. When supervision weakens, informal hierarchies rise. In some accounts reported by journalists covering the prison system, young inmates described corridors where certain individuals controlled access to phones or showers. These claims, while reported by credible outlets, are difficult to independently verify in every case, but the pattern of intimidation was acknowledged by oversight bodies. And when fear becomes normalized, violence becomes currency. But the story isn't just about fights. It's about vulnerability. According to HM Inspectorate reports, many of the boys at Feltham had histories of trauma, exclusion from school, mental health challenges, and unstable housing. Some had been in care. Some had been victims of violence long before they became perpetrators. Youth custody in the UK has shrunk dramatically over the last decade. The overall number of children in detention has fallen significantly since the early 2000s. But here's the paradox. As the population decreased, the complexity of cases increased. Those who remain in custody often present higher risks and deeper needs. Feltham became, in effect, a concentration point for some of the most troubled young offenders in the country. In 2020, a critical inspection described Feltham A as failing to keep children safe. Inspectors found that violence levels were too high and that too many boys reported feeling unsafe. There were concerns about segregation practices, isolating young people for extended periods. There were concerns about education delivery. There were concerns about staff-inmate relationships. The COVID-19 pandemic added another layer of strain. Lockdowns meant young inmates spent longer periods confined to cells. Education programs were disrupted. Visits were restricted. Isolation, especially for teenagers, carries psychological consequences. Reports documented increased frustration, mental health deterioration, and tension. When you lock hundreds of adolescent males with gang histories into confined spaces for extended periods, the pressure builds. And eventually, it explodes. But here's where the story complicates. Feltham is not a lawless wasteland. It is a state-run institution under constant monitoring. There are officers who risk assault daily to maintain order. There are teachers who show up every morning to run classes inside secure units. There are rehabilitation programs that have changed lives. Multiple inspection reports also note improvements during certain periods, better leadership, improved safeguarding measures, increased oversight. The narrative isn't simple. It's a cycle. Crisis. Reform. Improvement. Relapse. And the young people caught in that cycle often age out before the system stabilizes. One former inmate, whose identity we are withholding for privacy, described his first night inside Feltham to a journalist in an interview several years after release. He said the noise was the worst part. Shouting from other cells. Metal doors slamming. Officers giving orders. Someone crying somewhere down the corridor. He said he realized quickly that showing fear would make him a target. So he adapted. He aligned with people from his area. He learned the informal rules. He watched who had influence. Within weeks, he was involved in a fight. According to public reporting, this pattern, rapid escalation into violence, is not uncommon in youth custody settings where gang affiliations are present. It's survival. Or at least, that's how it feels. Meanwhile, outside the walls, politicians debate policy. Should youth custody focus more on discipline? Or more on therapeutic intervention? Is the problem underfunding? Or leadership? According to Ministry of Justice data, assaults in youth custody facilities have fluctuated year by year, but serious incidents have remained a concern. Independent watchdogs continue to publish findings that oscillate between cautious optimism and sharp criticism. Feltham has, at times, been described as improving under new governors. At other times, it has been labeled one of the most challenging institutions in the country. The truth lies somewhere in between. There's another uncomfortable reality. Most of the boys inside Feltham will eventually be released. If they leave more traumatized than when they entered, what happens next? Research on youth detention outcomes suggests that exposure to violence inside custody can increase the likelihood of reoffending. That doesn't mean detention causes crime. But it raises a question. If a facility designed for rehabilitation becomes a battleground, what does rehabilitation look like? In 2022 and 2023, further inspections noted some improvements in safety metrics compared to previous years, though challenges remained. The Youth Custody Service implemented reforms aimed at reducing violence and improving education access. Specialist units were introduced for particularly vulnerable children. Staff training programs were expanded. But critics argue that structural issues, staffing shortages, funding constraints, complex inmate profiles, continue to strain the system. Feltham remains a symbol. To some, it represents a broken youth justice model. To others, it represents an institution struggling under impossible expectations. Here's the shocking fact that often gets overlooked. The majority of boys held at Feltham are there for violent offenses. Not petty theft. Not minor mischief. Serious crimes. Robbery. Assault. Weapons charges. According to publicly available data from the Youth Justice Board, violent offences account for a large proportion of youth custody cases in England and Wales. That changes the risk landscape entirely. Managing teenagers with serious violent backgrounds requires resources, expertise, and stability. When any of those elements falter, instability spreads quickly. And yet, there are success stories. Former inmates have gone on record describing mentors inside who changed their trajectory. Education programs have helped some gain qualifications for the first time. Charities working within Feltham have reported breakthroughs with individuals previously written off. But those stories rarely make headlines. Violence does. Scandal does. Failure does. So here's the question we're left with. Is HMP Feltham a dangerous institution filled with uncontrollable violence? Or is it a mirror reflecting deeper social fractures, poverty, gang culture, systemic neglect? According to official reports, it is both a place of serious challenge and ongoing reform. It is not fictional. It is not exaggerated. It didn't start as something serious. No alarms. No emergency response. No indication that, within minutes, the entire wing would shift from routine to chaos. According to reports and reconstructed accounts based on patterns documented in UK youth custody investigations, incidents like this often begin the same way. A look. A comment. A challenge. It was late afternoon. Movement time. Doors unlocking across the landing. Young inmates stepping out into the corridor, some heading for showers, others toward association areas, some just looking for a break from the cell. Moments like this are fragile. Because for a short window, structure loosens. And when structure loosens, tensions surface. Two boys, we'll refer to them as Jay and Malik, pseudonyms used for privacy, had history. Not personal, at least not at first. But they came from rival areas in London. Different postcodes. Different affiliations. According to widely reported patterns in custody settings, that alone is often enough to create tension. Earlier that week, there had been a minor disagreement. Something small. A misunderstanding over shared space. A perceived slight. Nothing that triggered a formal report. But inside environments like Feltham, small things don't disappear. They sit. They grow. They wait. On this particular afternoon, witnesses later described a moment of eye contact. Prolonged. Deliberate. Then a comment, content unclear, and in some accounts, disputed. It doesn't matter what was said. What matters is how it was received. Because perception, inside Feltham, often outweighs intent. Jay stepped forward. Malik didn't move. That alone changed the dynamic. Because in these environments, backing down isn't neutral. It's interpreted. Sometimes as weakness. Sometimes as strategy. But always as something. The first push happened quickly. Not a full strike. More like a test. A boundary check. Staff weren't immediately present in that exact spot, a detail consistent with inspection findings noting supervision gaps at certain times. And in that brief absence, escalation began. What followed lasted less than a minute. But its impact lasted far longer. Punches. Shouting. Movement from others nearby. Some stepping in. Some stepping back. Because when violence starts, people make decisions fast. Engage. Or avoid. According to general incident patterns documented in youth custody reports, situations like this can escalate rapidly when groups become involved. And that's exactly what began to happen. Not a coordinated attack. Not a planned fight. But a shift. Sides forming. Tension spreading across the landing. By the time staff arrived, the situation had already moved beyond a simple altercation. Officers intervened. Commands were given. Separation attempted. But separating individuals in a charged environment is never simple. Because even after physical distance is created, emotional momentum remains. The incident was contained. Eventually. But not cleanly. And not without consequences. Jay sustained visible injuries. Malik as well. Neither life-threatening, according to accounts consistent with similar documented incidents. But serious enough to trigger internal reporting. And more importantly, serious enough to trigger attention. Because it wasn't just the fight. It was what the fight revealed. In the aftermath, tension across the unit increased. According to patterns noted in inspection reports, incidents rarely exist in isolation. They ripple. Alliances tighten. Retaliation becomes a possibility. Staff presence increases. Movement becomes more restricted. The atmosphere changes. For some boys, this incident confirmed what they already believed. That safety was conditional. That violence could happen at any moment. That control was not absolute. For staff, it reinforced a different concern. That supervision gaps, even brief ones, could lead to escalation. And that once escalation begins, regaining control requires more resources than preventing it would have. Internal reviews followed. Standard procedure. Incident reports filed. Statements collected. Footage reviewed where available. But as with many incidents in custody settings, not every detail aligned. Some accounts conflicted. Some details remained unclear. And certain aspects, according to reports, were never fully verified. What was clear, however, was the broader pattern. This wasn't an isolated breakdown. It was part of a larger issue. According to HM Inspectorate findings around that period, Feltham had been experiencing repeated incidents of violence that, while individually manageable, collectively indicated systemic strain. Each event added pressure. Each response stretched resources. And over time, the margin for error narrowed. There's a concept often discussed in custodial environments. Flashpoints. Moments where tension converts into action. They're unpredictable. But not random. They occur where pressure has already built. This was one of those flashpoints. Not the largest. Not the most severe. But significant enough to expose underlying instability. In interviews conducted by journalists and summarized in public reporting, former inmates have described how quickly environments can shift after an incident. Routine disappears. Trust drops. Movement becomes restricted. And everyone becomes more alert. After this confrontation, that shift was noticeable. Staff increased monitoring. Group interactions were more controlled. But increased control can have unintended effects. Because restriction can reduce opportunity for violence. But it can also increase frustration. Some boys responded by withdrawing. Spending more time in cells. Avoiding interaction. Others reacted differently. Becoming more assertive. More defensive. Because in environments shaped by perceived risk, behavior adapts quickly. Mental health teams were involved. As they often are following incidents. Assessments conducted. Support offered. But resources, according to multiple reports across the youth custody system, have often been stretched. And demand frequently exceeds availability. One detail, mentioned briefly in follow-up reporting on similar incidents, stands out. Not because it's dramatic. But because it's consistent. A staff member noting that the incident could have been prevented with more presence. Not certainty. But possibility. And that's the recurring theme. Not inevitability. But preventability. Because incidents like this don't emerge from nowhere. They build. Through tension. Through perception. Through environment. In the weeks that followed, additional measures were introduced. More structured movement. Closer supervision. Efforts to separate known rival individuals. Standard responses. Necessary responses. But reactive. And that distinction matters. Because reactive systems manage outcomes. Proactive systems shape them. At Feltham, during this period, the balance leaned too far toward reaction. The incident didn't make national headlines. There was no viral footage. No public outcry tied to this specific event. But internally, it mattered. Because it was one of many. And together, those incidents formed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. Inspectors would later return. Reports would be updated. Recommendations would be made. And change, slow, uneven, but real, would begin to take shape. But before reform comes recognition. And before recognition comes evidence. This incident was part of that evidence. A moment where the system revealed its pressure points. A moment that showed how quickly control could be tested. And how fragile stability really was. Because inside HMP Feltham, control isn't just about locks and keys. By the time the pressure became impossible to ignore. Change was no longer optional. It was necessary. Following repeated inspections, public scrutiny, and internal reviews, HMP Feltham became a priority for reform within the UK's youth custody service. Not because it was the only institution facing challenges. But because it had become a symbol. A warning sign. A place where the cracks in the system were too visible to dismiss. The response began with leadership. New governors were brought in during key periods, tasked with stabilizing the environment. Setting clearer expectations. Rebuilding trust between staff and inmates. Leadership changes are often the first step in institutional reform. Because culture starts at the top. But culture doesn't change overnight. And inside Feltham, the existing dynamics were deeply embedded. One of the first priorities was safety. Reducing violence. Increasing supervision. Restoring a sense of control. According to follow-up reports from HM Inspectorate of Prisons in subsequent years, there were measurable efforts to improve staffing levels. Recruitment increased. Training programs expanded. Retention strategies were introduced. More officers on the landings meant faster responses. Greater presence. Fewer blind spots. But numbers alone don't solve everything. Because experience still takes time to build. And trust, both among staff and between staff and inmates, takes even longer. So the reforms went deeper. A renewed focus was placed on relationships. Staff were encouraged to engage more consistently with young people. Not just as authority figures, but as stabilizing influences. Because research in youth justice consistently shows that positive relationships can reduce violence. Not eliminate it, but reduce it. At Feltham, efforts were made to assign key workers to individuals. Staff members responsible for maintaining regular contact with specific boys. Tracking their progress. Understanding their behavior. Identifying risks early. This wasn't a new concept. But implementation became more structured. More intentional. Education was also targeted for improvement. Because without structure, everything else becomes harder. Steps were taken to increase access to classes. Stabilize schedules. Ensure that more young people were engaged in learning or vocational training during the day. According to later inspection findings, there were signs of progress in this area. More consistent delivery. Better participation. But challenges remained. Because education inside custody depends on stability. And stability was still a work in progress. Mental health support received increased attention. Specialist teams expanded. Screening processes improved. Interventions became more targeted. This was critical. Because many of the behaviors seen inside Feltham weren't just disciplinary issues. They were expressions of deeper problems. Trauma. Anxiety. Unresolved anger. Addressing those issues doesn't produce immediate results. But over time, it can change trajectories. There were also changes to how violence was managed. More focus on prevention. Better intelligence gathering within the institution. Improved communication between staff about potential risks. Separating known rivals became more strategic. Movement was more controlled. Flashpoints were identified earlier. According to reports, these measures contributed to periods where violence levels showed signs of reduction. Not elimination, but improvement. However, reform rarely follows a straight line. Because while systems were changing, the environment outside was also evolving. Gang dynamics in London continued to shift. New conflicts emerged. New affiliations formed. And those dynamics didn't stop at the prison gates. Young people arriving at Feltham brought those realities with them. And sometimes, faster than reforms could adapt. There's also the human factor. Not every individual responds the same way to intervention. Some engage. Some resist. Some fluctuate between both. And in a setting where every individual has a complex background, consistency becomes difficult to maintain. One of the key challenges noted in later assessments was sustainability. Not just implementing change, but maintaining it. Because initial improvements can fade if systems aren't continuously supported. If staffing drops again. If resources tighten. If leadership changes. Feltham had experienced cycles before. Improvement followed by regression. Progress followed by setbacks. The question was whether this time would be different. In more recent findings, inspectors acknowledged areas of progress. Better staff engagement. Improved safety perceptions among some inmates. More structured routines. But they also noted ongoing challenges. Violence had not disappeared. Tensions remained. And the complexity of the population continued to test the system. So what does that mean? It means Feltham exists in a state of balance. Not fixed. Not broken. But constantly adjusting. A place where progress is real. But fragile. And that fragility is what defines it. Because behind every policy, every reform, every statistic, there are individuals. A 16-year-old trying to navigate alliances he never chose. An officer managing a unit where every decision carries risk. A teacher trying to hold a class together in an unpredictable environment. Each one part of the same system. Each one affected by its strengths. And its weaknesses. There's no single moment where Feltham changed. No clear turning point where everything became stable. Instead, there are phases. Moments of improvement. Moments of strain. And in between those moments, life continues inside the walls. Doors open. Doors close. Routine resumes. Tension rises. Tension falls. The system moves. Constantly. And outside those walls, the narrative continues. Headlines focus on incidents. Reports highlight failures. Debates question effectiveness. But the full picture is more complex. Feltham is not just a place of violence. It's also a place of effort. Of attempted reform. Of people trying, within limits, to create change. And sometimes, that change works. A young person leaves with qualifications they didn't have before. Another reconnects with family. Another chooses a different path. Those stories don't erase the problems. But they exist alongside them. And that dual reality is what makes Feltham difficult to define. It is not the worst-case scenario. But it is not a success story either. It is something in between. A system under pressure. Trying to adapt. So when people ask, is HMP Feltham dangerous? The answer isn't simple. According to official reports, it has been a place where safety has, at times, fallen below expected standards. Where violence has been a serious concern. Where reform has been necessary. But it is also a place where oversight exists. Where change is ongoing. Where outcomes are still being shaped. And that's the truth. Not exaggerated. Not simplified. But documented. Because in the end, Feltham is not just a prison. It's a reflection. Of policy. Of society. Of the challenges of trying to rehabilitate young people in environments that are, by nature, restrictive. And until those broader challenges are addressed, places like Feltham will continue to exist in that same tension. Between control and chaos. Between failure and reform. Between what the system is. And what it's trying to become. And that's where this story ends. If you made it this far, subscribe to Goody Crime TV, because the stories they don't fully tell are the ones that matter most.